Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Taalay Ahmed, and I've had the good fortune of working in MTA for the last several years. And as part of the MTA team, I've from time to time been able to join the crew that films various events at which Hazrat Khalifatul Masih is attending. And for this reason, I've been able to observe Huzoor at close quarters. And perhaps this is the reason why that Majlis Atfal Ahmadiyya asked me to say a few words about Huzoor's blessed character for the Virtual Atfal Rally 2020. One of the programs that I've had the honor of contributing to, of being part of the team that works towards it, is This Week with Huzoor. And that program launched in November 2018. And the first week went great, by the grace of Allah. But the second week, the second program that we made, I made a huge mistake. And that evening I came home, the program broadcast with the huge mistake as part of it. And I went to sleep, and around midnight I received a text informing me that Huzoor had seen the program and seen the mistake. And for this reason, the program needed to be removed from all social media. At the time I was asleep, so I read the message at around Fajr time. And of course I was devastated. One issue was that, of course, I had personally made such a big error that had broadcast on MTA, but even greater than that was the fact that Huzoor was disappointed with me, and it was just a completely terrible feeling that I can't explain how bad somebody feels when they know that it's in Huzoor's knowledge that they've done something incorrect and that he's been disappointed. So I had these feelings, and as was instructed, the program was removed from social media. And that evening I had an opportunity to attend a mulakat at which Hazrat Khalifatul Masih would be present. And at the time I was extremely nervous because I wondered whether I should either attend, but I thought it's best that I do attend. And I thought I'll hide at the back, and then Huzoor, nobody will really notice me, and I can just sit there in silence, and at the end of the mulakat, I'll leave with everyone else, and it'll pass like this. So I arrived at the mulakat, but when I arrived, my expectations were completely reversed, because Huzoor came and he began to tell jokes, and each time he would tell a joke, he would turn towards me and he would say, "Hana Taalay?" Like, "Don't you agree, Taalay?" And I would, and then he'd start laughing and smiling with a big, broad smile. And I was completely shocked. I was so stunned I could barely reply, let alone think what was happening, because it was such a reversal of what my initial expectations had been. Huzoor's never been anything other than kind to me, but of course I thought that it would be very awkward, and yet Huzoor was here being the absolute embodiment of forgiving and kind and loving. So that was one occasion, but unfortunately, the mistakes that I made didn't end there. And in the early development of the program, there were a number of occasions when things weren't according to the level that they should have been. And so on one similar occasion, similarly, there was a mulakat that was going to happen, and I thought I would hide behind the door, sort of the entrance door, and would be able to listen to what was happening to the mulakat without necessarily being involved. And at this time, there had been such a run of errors within the work that I was producing that I was really deeply, deeply sad. And I was wondering even whether people would require me to continue on this program, because I thought, initially I thought when I'd made the first mistake that the program might even be cancelled. But instead, Huzoor had given guidance that we should continue and work harder. But at this point, I thought, okay, the program will continue, but whether I'm asked to be part of the team that produces the program or not, that I wasn't sure of, and I was just deeply, deeply sad. And my hopes were becoming reduced. At that moment, Huzoor he came to the entrance, but instead of walking past me, he suddenly stopped. And he took hold of my arm, and he turned towards me, and Huzoor, in a very low voice so that other people perhaps couldn't hear, explained the mistakes I'd been making, but said that it gave me a renewed sense of hope. He said that I should go and seek advice from people like Asif Basit Saab, who's the director of programming within MTA, and he said by being trained in this manner, I would be able to eradicate the greater bulk of these weaknesses within a very short period of time. And so where I'd been completely sad and low and unable to see hope in the future, Huzoor just filled me with hope. And then Huzoor asked that there had been a group mulaqat, a delegation that had come to see him recently, and he asked, did you attend this? And I said no. And then the instruction came that when these sorts of events happen, I should attend. And so where I'd thought that because I'd made some mistakes that maybe I would be removed from the team, instead Huzoor brought me closer and involved me even further with the work for that program. I don't want to dwell endlessly on the various mistakes that I made while producing this program, but I will mention one more, and the reason is that when we watch a football match, we often see the commentators say, or the players themselves say, that they would run through a wall for a manager, or run through a brick wall for a manager. And of course, the work of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is far more important than a mere football match. But I've often seen that the way Huzoor addresses his workers and cares for his workers, he gives guidance with such wisdom that you become so motivated, you feel like you could actually run through a wall to fulfill the instructions of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih. And I wish to give one example in that regard as well. When Huzoor moved from the Fazl Mosque to Islamabad, again, I was part of the team that prepared a program on that occasion, but once more there were some shortcomings. Essentially what it came down to was that the program didn't capture the grandeur of the occasion, the great blessing that Allah the Almighty had given in bringing about this move from the Fazl Mosque to Islamabad. And then when it went for checking, then this was the feedback that returned from Hazrat Khalifatul Masih. At that time, it was quite late on Thursday night, around Isha time, and the program was due to broadcast the following evening on Friday. So we were running out of time, and the MTA team returned to work because we were asked to basically more or less start again from scratch. Now, normally it would take a week to produce this program, and so we were under a lot of time pressure. At that moment, we received a message from Abid Khan Saab. Abid Khan Saab, some of you will know, is the press secretary of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, but he's also the head of the MTN News department, and so This Week with Huzoor, the program, comes under him. And he said that Huzoor sent a message to the workers. He has said that on one occasion, Hazrat Muslim Maud attended the first day of Jalsa, and he saw that the arrangements weren't adequate for the number of people attending Jalsa. And he expressed this. And at the time, the Sadr of Majlis Khudam al-Ahmadiyya was Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmed. And when Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmed heard these words, he gathered all the Khudam who were on duty, and together Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmed and those Khudam worked all night. They worked through the night. And when Hazrat Muslim Maud returned the next day, he was pleased to see that the arrangements had been brought up to the standard. And Huzoor said that as Waqf-e-Zindagis, as workers in MTA, we should remember that our time at work doesn't come to an end at 8 p.m. But instead, our time comes to an end when the work has been completed. Now, on the one hand, we've been told that the program wasn't good enough, but look how Huzoor motivated us, that he gave us so much hope at the same time that if you just work one more night on this program, in the morning, I will be as pleased with you as Hazrat Muslim Maud was with Khudam al-Ahmadiyya in his age on that occasion at Jalsa. And so with these words, Sarab Zishan Saab from production and Sayyid Wasim Saab and myself were there, and we worked through the night till around Fajr time. And at Fajr time, we brought the first round of the work to an end, but we returned early in the morning, and we continued the work, and we continued through the day. And by the grace and blessings of Allah, we were able to complete the work in time, and the program broadcast at the correct hour. After it broadcast, I can say that normally for an episode of This Week with Huzoor, we would take a full week to prepare the episode, but on this occasion we prepared it overnight. Yet we prepared it with the instructions and guidance of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih. So even though it was prepared in less than 24 hours, just in one night, that program happened to be the most popular that we've ever had, with the largest viewing figures we've ever had for This Week with Huzoor, and it remains so to this day. So after making a number of mistakes in the early development of This Week with Huzoor, I suggested to the head of my department, Abid Khan Sahib, that the best thing to do would be to have, if the news team could have a mulaqat directly with Hazrat Khalifatul Masih and learn and understand from his guidance directly. By the grace of Allah, Huzoor accepted this suggestion and invited us for a mulaqat in Islamabad with the Waqf Zindagis from MTA News. During that mulaqat, I asked Huzoor, what are your expectations from the program This Week with Huzoor? And his answer surprised me. Huzoor said, it's not about my expectations. It's about the expectations or the requirements of the Ahmadi Muslims around the world. So you should go and speak to the Ahmadis and find out what they think of the program and how they think it can be improved. What that answer demonstrated to me was, first of all, Huzoor's extreme humility, but secondly, his love for the Ahmadis around the world, in that he was saying this. It reminds me of a quote of Huzoor's that he made in 2014.
दुनिया का कोई मुल्क नहीं जहाँ रात सोने से पहले चश्मे तसव्वुर में मैं ना पहुँचता हूँ और उनके लिए सोते वक्त भी और जागते वक्त भी दुआ न हो.
One of the things I also want to talk about, and one of the things we've tried to cover on the program This Week with Huzoor, is Huzoor's relentless schedule. Particularly when Huzoor was at Fazl Mosque, we produced an actual episode which covered his routine. Huzoor has mentioned how he wakes up for tahajjud before Fajr, and then in the morning we would see Huzoor would begin his office hours, and from early in the day, in the morning, we would see official mulaqats beginning and workers of the Ahmadi Muslim community coming to receive guidance from Huzoor. Then in the evening, we would see that many Ahmadi families would arrive and they would have their mulaqats as was scheduled. And apart from this, at the time I was told, and this was while Huzoor was still at Fazl Mosque, I was told by the private secretary, Munir Javed Saab, that Huzoor receives 10,000 letters a week and personally gives hundreds of replies. And I've been told since that the numbers have increased actually. So Huzoor was extremely busy. But one thing we also saw was that on an evening after Isha, Huzoor would invite members of his extended family would graciously invite them to join him for a mulaqat after Isha. Now, bearing in mind that Isha takes place quite late in the summer, this could be quite late at night. And it might by the time it came to an end, it might be coming close to 10 p.m. Yet we would see that at 10 p.m., the private secretary staff had either left or they would be leaving at this time. And at that moment, when the mulaqat came to an end, Huzoor would return from his residence to his office and would continue his work by himself with the private secretary's office emptied. I have mentioned Huzoor's exceptional schedule under normal days, so you can only begin to imagine how hard Huzoor has to work during the Jalsa period. And so during Jalsa 2019, we saw that Huzoor's meetings, apart from the 5 lengthy speeches he had to prepare and deliver and the Bai'at ceremony, his meetings with delegations would last late into the night. And then there were so many delegations that required his time, it wasn't possible for him to meet them all during the Jalsa days themselves. So for perhaps around 10 days after Jalsa, Huzoor would continue having meetings with Jalsa delegations, and they would last for many hours each day. And on top of this, he would meet perhaps 70 or so families each day from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as well. Huzoor was so busy that we made a decision, the MTN News team made a decision that the episode of This Week with Huzoor from the Jalsa week, we wouldn't send it to Huzoor to check before broadcast. And the reason for this was that we thought that Huzoor is so busy that it would almost be just an added burden on his time for us to expect him to give specific guidance that week. The following day after broadcast, Huzoor's meetings with the delegations were continuing in his office, and it was several hours of meetings with many delegations, one after another. I happened to be filming there on camera, and Abid Khan Sahib was there as his press secretary, but of course Abid Khan Sahib is also the head of MTN News. So Abid Sahib, in between one delegation leaving and the next delegation arriving, Abid Sahib approached Huzoor and said, "Huzoor, we broadcast the This Week with Huzoor program yesterday." And Huzoor said, "Yes, I know, I've seen, and it's okay now you've done it, but you didn't send it to me for approval." So this shows that even at such a busy time, when Huzoor almost doesn't have a single moment of rest for weeks on end, Huzoor is still so diligent and so determined to continue his service to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community that he's still involved with every aspect in every department. I have mentioned mulaqats for the extended family. My son Talal, who when he was very young, perhaps around 12 months old, a year old, he developed quite a funny habit. When the mulaqat would come to an end and Huzoor would be leaving his residence, my son would run behind him and he would start saying, "Bahar jana hai, I want to go outside, I want to go outside." And because he was only learning to speak and he didn't know very many words, I think what he meant was that, "Huzoor, I want to see where you go when you finish this mulaqat, when you leave this door, where do you go to?" So this happened on a few occasions, and on this third or fourth occasion maybe, Huzoor, I would always try and hold my son back and take him to the right place, but Huzoor turned to him and sort of asked him to come with him. So we had this interesting scene where Huzoor was walking down the stairs, and by his side by side, perhaps holding hands, was my son. But my son had only just learned to walk, so after 4 or 5 steps, it became clear that he was going to take a while walking down the stairs. So Huzoor turned to him and motioned that he can join Huzoor and Huzoor will pick him up. And so my son readily agreed, and Huzoor picked him up and carried him all the way down the stairs. And then when he'd got to the bottom of the stairs, Huzoor turned into his office. And at that point, I'd been following to make sure that my son would behave in the proper, respectful manner. But when Huzoor entered his office, I thought that it would be wrong for me to enter Huzoor's office without an invitation. So I waited outside and wondered what was going on inside. And after a minute or two, whatever happened must have, the tour that had happened within the office must have come to an end, because the door opened once again, and standing there was Huzoor, and in his arms was my son. But now my son was carrying a giant box of chocolates, and so that brought that occasion to an end. But by the grace of Allah, I would say that, and I'm sure the MT International team can testify, those who followed Huzoor around the world, that there is nothing special about my son or about me. The special person is Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen, because with every child that I've seen of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community on many, many occasions, Huzoor is always ready to show very special love to the children of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
In Silver Spring, you had given me a Milky Way and a pen. I still have those 2 things.
You met me in Datul Rahman,
Yes.
and there I gave you something. Now come in again. Take another one.
Nice.
Acha, you are more confident than your brother. Huh? And that chocolate, I think, must have expired now. So you take this new one, and they take this with right hand. Take this pen and use it now.
These mulaqats for the extended family of Huzoor would normally last for about 5 or 10 minutes, but there were occasions when they would go on for a little bit longer. And one of these exceptions comes to mind was when Huzoor's cousin Khala Amtulhi was very seriously ill, and in fact she was in the final period of her life. And I'm sure and I'm aware that she was advised, medically advised, that she should take complete rest. But such was her love for Khilafat and her desire to be near Hazrat Khalifatul Masih that nonetheless she would make the journey to join these mulaqats after Isha. And so when Huzoor would see her and her family arrive, at least on one occasion, if not more, he would extend it, and he would extend the mulaqat to such an extent that it might last for 40 minutes or maybe even a little bit more. And I'm sure that Huzoor's time, his care and attention on these occasions was an extreme source of comfort for Khala Amtulhi and her family. But even then, after such an extension, after such a long mulaqat, we would see, and quite late at night, Huzoor would stand, and after these lengthy mulaqats, he would return to his office and continue his work for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Again, I'm sure that many people around the world in the community can testify that this care for people who might have a health condition or a health worry isn't unique to Khala Amtulhi, but in fact is something that Huzoor has for the whole community, in fact, the whole of humanity, and many of us can testify to it. I was once taking an interview with Atfal Virtual Rally, who has had the good fortune of traveling with Huzoor as part of his Qafla on many tours around different countries in the world. And he told me quite an inspiring incident. In 2018, Huzoor was traveling to Spain for a visit to the Jamaat there. And Atfal Virtual Rally had the good fortune of joining him. But Atfal Virtual Rally had had an illness for quite a while, and the illness meant that whenever he traveled, he'd have a fever. And the same happened when he joined Huzoor on that occasion. On the first day, he developed a fever. On the second day, the fever continued. And by the third day, it was so bad that Atfal Virtual Rally was unable to join the Fajr prayers. At Zohar time, Huzoor saw him and asked, "What happened to you? Were you unwell that you didn't join the Fajr prayers?" And Atfal Virtual Rally explained the situation. At that point, he says that Huzoor took hold of him and held him for a while. And then Huzoor said that this fever has gone now. The time that I was interviewing Atfal Virtual Rally was many months later, almost a year later. And he told me that since that day, even though previously he would get this fever all the time, especially when he traveled, since that day, the fever went by the evening after Huzoor said that the fever is gone now. It went, and then it never came back. And even his families and loved ones and those people who know Atfal Virtual Rally well and knew he had this illness and he would get this fever regularly are asking him, "What's happened to your health?" And he just would say, "Huzoor has prayed for me." There's also one incident of my own which I can mention, although it's certainly not comparable or as serious, but I think perhaps people will find it a little bit amusing. I was once playing football and I hurt my hamstring a little bit. I got a little injury, and so I decided to write a letter to Huzoor. Over the years, I've received a lot of advice from different people about how best to write a letter to Huzoor, and one piece of advice was that you should keep it short and get to the point so as not to waste any time or not to write pages and pages, and I think that's a good piece of advice. And secondly, that somebody had perhaps told me that if you handwrite a letter, then it adds a personal touch. And I think that both of these pieces of advice have their place, but they also have their limits, and I managed to find the limits of both these pieces of advice on this particular occasion. So having had a hamstring injury, I decided to write a letter to Huzoor in which I wrote, and I had another concern as well. So I decided to mention both those concerns in the following manner: that after the basic formalities of the letter, I wrote, Huzoor, I have a health concern and I have a financial concern, so please pray. The following day, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I picked up the phone call, I asked who it was, and they introduced themselves as a member of staff at Huzoor's private secretary's office, and they asked me that Huzoor has read your letter. And I said, which letter? Because it slipped my mind. I couldn't even remember. I said, which letter? And they said, the one in which you say you have a health and a financial concern. And I was like, oh. And they said, Huzoor has asked to see you, so you'd better come in tomorrow. So the following day, I arrived at the private secretary's office and then made my way as appropriate to, when called, to Huzoor's office. And as soon as I walked in, Huzoor asked me, what is this health concern you have? I said, Huzoor, I've got a slight strain in my hamstring. And then Huzoor said, what is the financial concern you have? And I said, Huzoor, I received a parking ticket. And then Huzoor said, how much was that for? £10? And then I was a little bit... and then Huzoor said, as far as your health concern goes, write to me what it is exactly so that I can prescribe some medicine. And as far as your financial concern goes, be more careful in where you park in future. And then Huzoor had added that when you write to me, don't handwrite it anymore because nobody can read your handwriting. So please type it out in future. So then the mulaqat came to an end, but something interesting happened afterwards, which was, first of all, that the hamstring that I'd had been causing me discomfort since the injury. And almost as soon as the mulaqat came to an end, or as soon as it came to an end, I could feel that it was better. And my fellow footballers who'd had the injury before said that it would cause me discomfort for 3 weeks to a month. But my recovery was almost instant. And I think people even commented that how was I able to play again so soon? And the second thing that happened was that I'd had 3 parking tickets outside my house from the same council in the months before, and I'd appealed all 3 of them. But the first 2 times I hadn't written to Huzoor and the appeal had been rejected. And on the third occasion, 2 months passed and they hadn't replied. And so I followed up with them that I appealed this parking ticket and you haven't made a decision. And they sent me a letter, the council sent me a letter, and they said that actually we think that you were in the wrong and you deserve the parking ticket, but because 2 months have passed, legally we can't enforce it anymore. And with this, in this way, the parking ticket was also dismissed. By the grace of Allah, I believe that both of these outcomes were a blessing of having written to Huzoor and having requested his prayers, alhamdulillah. I want to turn to a slightly more serious incident now, which is that when my wife was pregnant, she also had a health concern. And we happened to be at a mulaqat with Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen. There was a group of people there, not just my wife and I, quite a few people. And Huzoor looked at her face, and I think she'd been fine when we set off for the mulaqat, otherwise, of course, I wouldn't have set off. But as it had been quite a long journey to Islamabad, and close to Islamabad, she started to feel a little bit unwell. And Huzoor took a look at her face and could immediately tell and see, and he became worried. And he asked his granddaughter to take my wife to Huzoor's kitchen and serve her some medicine. But when my wife left the room, Huzoor remained quiet, and you could see on his face that he was still concerned and he wasn't satisfied with the situation. So after a few more seconds, he stood up himself and followed into the kitchen, and the mulaqat came to an end. And when he went to the kitchen, he took out some water and he put some sugar in it, and he put some medicine in it. And it seems that whatever the problem was, he'd identified it completely correctly, because in a few minutes my wife felt better and we were able to return home. But even then, Huzoor's kindness and the kindness of his family didn't end, because as we were leaving, Huzoor's respected wife, Khala Sabui, said to us that as soon as you reach home, you should send a message through someone that we've arrived home safely. And I think the reason perhaps was that Huzoor and his family were so concerned and are so loving that they would remain worried and praying until they received good news that everything was okay. Unfortunately, although at the time she felt better, perhaps some weeks later or some time later, her medical concerns during the pregnancy hadn't come to an end. And it reached such a stage that my wife's condition was such that I had to take her to hospital in quite an emergency. The information reached Huzoor that this was her condition and she'd had to go to hospital. And so Huzoor first sent a message that she should take such and such a medicine. But I think this wasn't enough. Huzoor's concern remained. So then he asked somebody to check if we had that medicine readily available. And we replied that we didn't have the medicine available in our house. And so this was during the Jalsa period, and Huzoor was extremely busy, but he also had family members from abroad who'd arrived and were staying at Islamabad for the Jalsa period. So he arranged for his nephew and niece to travel perhaps from Islamabad to London and deliver medicine to our hands. They came to St. George's Hospital in Tooting and delivered medicine to our hands, and this was quite late at night, perhaps around midnight. So this again was a demonstration of how much love and how much care Huzoor has for the Ahmadis and their health concerns. By the grace of Allah, with Huzoor's guidance, with his prayers, some months later, she made a full recovery, and some months later we were blessed with our second child. I think one of the things that we see when we look at Huzoor's character is how, as Hazrat Khalifatul Masih is the fifth successor of the promised Messiah alayhi salam, he's a perfect representation of the promised Messiah alayhi salam. He's a perfect representative for this era. He is Khalifa-e-Waqt. And these incidents that I've mentioned of his taking care of the Muslims who might have medical concerns reminds us of the promised Messiah alayhi salam. There were people in the promised Messiah alayhi salam's time where the doctor said that there's no hope for them, that they will pass away, and he would pray for them and show concern and love, and then they would make a recovery. And then there were other people where the doctor said that this person will now lose their sight and they will become blind, and the promised Messiah alayhi salam would pray, or in some cases they would just touch the person, and very soon thereafter they would make a recovery and they would be okay. So this reminds us, Huzoor in this way reminds us of the promised Messiah alayhi salam. But this isn't the only way. There's a very well-known incident of how some enemies of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community conspired with a magistrate in India, or perhaps British India at the time, against the promised Messiah alayhi salam, and they made a plan through completely false allegations. They would have him put in prison for quite an extended period of time. And they hurled a number of insulting comments towards him as well. And when news of this plan reached the promised Messiah alayhi salam, he said that I am the Lion of God. Let them try if they will. Let's see what happens. And of course, Allah the Almighty protected him, and their plans came to nothing. They failed completely. But one thing that struck me is this comment, Lion of God. What does it mean? And of course, I think one of the meanings is that the promised Messiah alayhi salam was always ready to defend Islam, to defend Allah the Almighty's cause, to defend the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, regardless of the opposition, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the plans of the enemies. And this is a quality that I've also seen in Hazrat Khalifatul Masih. One example springs to mind in Germany in 2019. Huzoor was in Berlin, and one morning he arrived at his office and found a journalist there. And the journalist began to ask him questions, and she was recording the interview, and Huzoor began to answer the questions. But you could see from the journalist, although she was completely polite, you could see that she'd done a lot of anti-Islam research, and her questions seemed to have an agenda, and in fact each of them seemed to be trying to attack Islam or test Islam's defenses from a different angle. Huzoor remained completely calm and very patiently and kindly explained the answers. A lot of the questions repeatedly seemed to imply that Muslim women, Muslim ladies are somehow mistreated in Islam.
We have our women's organization. They are very active. If you have ever happened to see our convention, you would have seen women organize the functions, and they are very much active in the Jamaat and in our community. There are quite a number of women who are doctors, teachers, architects, and they go outside to work and hold their meetings outside, their functions, and they have their separate setup.
But why separate? That's a question many people ask in Germany.
Because we believe that women can flourish better without the shade of men. So if they are free, they are separate, then they are free to grow. See, if you plant a small tree under a big tree, it cannot grow well. But at the same time, they have the same rights. Women have the right of divorce in Islam. Women have the right of inheritance in Islam. Women have other rights which were being denied some decades ago in the West. So now that you have those rights, but you cannot say that you are the champion of giving these rights to the women. It is the Islam who is the champion of giving the rights to the women.
So the interview came to an end, and Huzoor had beautifully answered all the questions. But there was one interesting thing that happened at the end of the interview. Huzoor began to apologize. He said, "I'm so sorry. Nobody told me that this interview was going to take place, and perhaps you were waiting for some time because I wasn't aware that it was going to happen." And it seemed that the first time Huzoor had become aware that the interview was scheduled in the program, it hadn't been written in the program, was when he walked into the office and found the journalist waiting for him. And I was so surprised that Huzoor, it was almost like an intellectual ambush had been set up in Huzoor's office, and instead of being surprised or perplexed, Huzoor had so perfectly and so calmly answered all the questions and emerged completely victorious. Another example of Huzoor's desire to defend Islam came during the Jalsa period in last year. And as I've mentioned, Huzoor was tremendously busy in those days. And there was a delegation from Spain. Now, to put this into context, a week before Jalsa, there had been quite a controversy in the national media, across the national media in the UK. What had happened was that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, had appointed somebody called Priti Patel to a very senior position. And the media had made a great fuss over the fact that Priti Patel in the past had made a number of comments in favor of the death penalty, capital punishment. And under this huge national pressure, Priti Patel gave an interview to the BBC and spoke to a number of newspapers in which she said she completely denied her previous views, backtracked, rejected them entirely, and said, no, I'm not in favor of the death penalty. So when this mulaqat came along with the Spanish delegation, one of the people picked up a microphone. He was a national politician in Spain, and he said that my daughter was kidnapped and murdered. In Islam, what would be the penalty be for somebody who committed those crimes? At the time he asked the question, I happened to be on camera, and I felt some tension. I was wondering how Huzoor will address this question in light of the fact that of what had happened in the UK over the last week, in light of the fact that most European countries are against the death penalty. And I was also wondering how there was a large delegation here, a number of dignitaries, a number of Spanish guests. I was wondering what their reaction would be to Islam's teachings. But Huzoor immediately answered that this is a heinous crime and it deserves capital punishment. With complete confidence, that was his immediate answer. It seemed that perhaps I wasn't the only person who was feeling some tension in the room, because when Huzoor gave his answer, the person who was translating from English to Spanish turned to Huzoor and repeated the answer back to him quietly, as though asking Huzoor, is this really what you want me to say? And Huzoor, with complete confidence, again repeated the answer, and then it was translated. And then Huzoor added that yes, in Islam you are allowed to forgive, but the forgiveness can only come, as in a reduction of the penalty, can only come from the family. It can't be enforced by the government or the courts on the victim's family. It's up to the victim's family to decide. When the Spanish politician heard this, he picked up the microphone and said, your answer has caused the anxiety to go from my heart, because I actually got into politics after the crime that was committed against my daughter, because I thought that the punishment was far too lenient, and I've been trying to change this punishment. And it seemed to me that the tension was removed from the room, and in fact, we saw that at the end of the Mulakat, large numbers of Spanish guests queued to have their photo taken with Huzoor and seemed extremely impressed with Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, by the grace of Allah, alhamdulillah. So when we see Huzoor in this role where he so courageously, like a lion of God, defends Islam, then we think that Huzoor shouldn't be by himself. We should join him, we should stand up to help him. And how can we do that? And this brings to mind one more question that somebody asked of Huzoor. The questioner said that when we look at the prophecies, the various religious prophecies, we see them being fulfilled one by one. And it seems from the prophecies that we're drawing very close to perhaps one of the final prophecies, which is the victory of Islam, Ahmadiyyat, in which large numbers of people will join Ahmadiyyat. So what is Huzoor's view on this? And Huzoor replied that Allah the Almighty had promised Moses and Aaron that they would be granted the promised land. But when Allah the Almighty asked the people of Moses and Aaron, although Moses and Aaron, Islam, the prophets Hazrat Moses and Hazrat Harun, were very much willing to do the work that was required, their people weren't willing to do so. And because of this, the promise was delayed for 40 years, even though it had been promised by Allah the Almighty. So Huzoor said that although there is a promise of the victory of Islam, Ahmadiyyat, whether it happens sooner or later depends on how hard we're willing to work. So now it's up to you on how hard you work. And when Huzoor said this, it seemed to me he was in particular addressing the younger people in the room. So I'm aware that many young people will be hearing this talk. I hope and pray that as you're being told during this Atfal Rally, during the various speeches and events, on how the expectations that Majlis Atfal al-Ahmadiyya has of you, on the requirements the Jamaat has on you, that we're able to learn from those, and we're able to serve Khilafat Ahmadiyya and understand our responsibilities. Ameen, thumma ameen.